The easiest place to see whether a heating idea works is not in a museum, but in the first hour after dark. People light a modest flame, close a door skinned by a hand's width, and the room either steadies like a well-tuned drum or fights back like a cracked one. A winter settlement with mixed building styles lets the comparison run side by side. One home meets the wind with a clever envelope and a small fire, while the next throws fuel at the same problem and never quite catches up. The first idea on trial is still the tippy liner, with its smoke flaps set like sails. A north wind does not overthrow it because the liner carries warm air up a hidden channel, and the flaps lean into the gust until the smoke column behaves. The surprise of newcomers is that less flame often fixes more discomfort. The smaller fire sharpens the draft, and the draft cleans the air, so eyes stop watering and hands stop trembling, even though the show in the hearth looks quieter. An elder sits with a curved backrest that returns heat to the chest, and the humor is dry because the gear is simple. The host points with a ladle and says the chair works harder than the logs, which is true because the chair steers radiation like a mirror. That sequence comes from observation, not romance. People learn by coughing on bad nights and sleeping well after a flap change, and they remembered which choice delivered comfort fast enough to become a habit. Thermal mass takes the second trial, and it is a different kind of patience. An earth lodge or a thick adobe room accepts heat like a bank taking deposits, and the payoff arrives at midnight when the air would otherwise fall through the floor. The hearth in such a room is not a stage because the walls are the actors. A coal bed sits steady on clay, and the benches along the ring hold a gentle gradient a visitor can feel with an open palm. Travelers like Lewis and Clark wrote that earth houses felt calm in severe weather, and that line has a physical reason. Mass slows change because it absorbs peaks and fills valleys, and a family can sleep between those slower swings without racing their fire. Historians disagree on the exact numbers because wood piles and diary entries do not line up neatly. Some argue for strong fuel savings tied to wall thickness and lower infiltration, while others caution that moisture and maintenance blur the gains and ask to see soil and drainage notes. Both positions allow a practical summary that the effect is real when the site is sound. A tight roof edge, a dry floor, and a careful smoke hole make the mass behave, and the hearth can run quieter without the house going cold. The plateau cold trap adds geometry rather than thickness, and it is immediately legible when you stand inside. The entrance sits lower than the sleeping ledges, and the cooler air pools where feet do not linger while the warm layer stays where people actually live. A ladder entry through a roof brings you into the warm band after a climb that is brief and exact. A tunnel entry puts the cold pool at the far edge of the room and turns corner into a soft baffle that steals the bite from wind. Archaeologists map these houses as circles in soil with ledges and central hearths that match the living memory in later notes. The smoke hole ring shows where hot air carried soot, and the clean ledges show where warmth returned without grime as a side effect. There is a small decision at dawn every time the door covering moves. If the house has a cold trap, the burst stays low and the benches keep their calm. If not, the entire volume churns, and a person chasing a hat also chases their heat for the next hour. Lamp heat from the Arctic looks gentle and turns out to be exact. A soapstone bowl with seal oil and a wick of moss or willow fluff gives a stable flame that warms air, cooks food at the lip, and grants a light that does not flicker like a bonfire. The room built for that lamp is the rest of the device. Snow or sod surrounds the space with a shell that refuses wind, and people trim the wick with a bone pick so the flame stays blue and honest rather than smoky and loud. Visitors often ask how snow can make a house warm when snow is cold. The answer is that the shell slows loss while the people supply energy, and the combination produces a climate where boots dry and breath no longer bites at the lungs. Researchers measure snow density and lamp output and arrive at different graphs because weather changes faster than a notebook can. One group focuses on reflectivity and moisture transport. Another stresses airflow paths and lamp placement. Both end at the same table where dinner is hot and the roof shines with frost. The hot stone battery looks humble and proves versatile. A stone warmed in a fire carries heat to a bed, a basket, or a traveler's lap, and it gives the heat back slowly with no chimney to feed and no sparks to chase. Stone boiling is both kitchen and climate control because steam matters in winter air. Hot stones hiss into a basket of water, stew rises to a simmer, and the room gains humidity that calms throats and stops wood from splitting, which is a health plan hiding in a recipe. Families reserve stones for this work and recognize them by weight and sound against clay. A good stone holds without cracking, and over a season it becomes part of the room, moving from hearth to bed like a quiet member of the team. Fuel banking and ember carry are the timekeepers that tie these hacks together. A coal bed is tucked under ash at night so a parent can lift dawn from a hidden glow, and that single habit saves kindling, temper and time across a long month. Travel turns the ember into a treasure. A coal rides inside punky wood or a horn with a stopper, and a midday tea on windblown ground arrives without drama because the fire never had to be invented again from a cold start. Modular insulation is the wardrobe of the house, and it changes faster than walls do. Mats of tulle or cattail, cedar bark liners, and snow berms move to answer a weather mood, and a room that breathed wide at noon can be snug by dusk because hands knew where to add a layer. Northwest cedar planks tell the same story in a new accent. Boards lean on a frame without nails so they can be tipped or slid, and a joint that was loose in summer tightens in wet cold to make the house kinder, while rain tries to drum it into compliance. A recap keeps the 7 working ideas clear as we turn pages. Convection liners, thermal mass, cold traps, lamp heat, hot stones, banked embers, and modular insulation are not ornaments. They are the spine of winter that lets small fires act like steady engines. Now the stakes rise as towns and trading posts grow because comfort meets regulation and fashion. Boards get cut to standard lengths, chimneys arrive with catalogues, and inspectors look for boxes that match drawings, while families keep reaching for the old edits that kept lungs happy. A mother hangs a quilt on an inner frame and transforms a drafty wall into a liner that behaves like a tipi cloth. A father piles snow against a foundation and creates the windbreak that a plank builder forgot, and the children laugh because the floor is not biting their ankles anymore. A stove sits in the middle like a visiting celebrity and needs manners. People build a low brick jacket around it so the room sees a soft pulse rather than spikes of heat. And suddenly the iron stops cracking bowls and starts acting like a partner. Humidity returns as an ally rather than a threat. A pot kept at a low simmer near the edge replaces the desert air a bright stove creates and coughs back off while wind frost lines up where it belongs instead of on blankets and throats. There is a decision each evening about how much work the appliance should do versus the building. A family that lets the room carry its share can read, mend, and talk without marching to the stove every 10 minutes. A family that asks the fire to do everything will get noise and ash in exchange for hurry. The story is not a romantic refusal of tools, it is a selective adoption. When iron can be wrapped, baffled and tuned, it serves the same old goals, and when it refuses, people quietly keep the wisdom that was warming them long before catalogues found the valley. One river bend in the North Plains offers a tight case study because notes survive across seasons. In a circle of earth lodges, one family tried a large stove without other changes and wrote about dry eyes and a chill at the edge. The neighbor added a small mass enclosure and a door curtain and wrote about sleeping through a wind event with steady breathing. An outsider might call those details quaint while their fuel bill rises with the temperature swing. The older plan costs more in memory and less in wood, which is a bargain that favors anyone who must haul their own heat. The Plains winter camp returns with a quieter revelation that would please any engineer. The liner gap in a tipi acts like a vertical duct, and if you place a hand at the edge of the cloth you feel a lift that does not stir hair at the sitting level, which is how to move air without throwing it at faces. Children learn that the best seat is not closest to the flame but at the back with a curve behind the shoulders. That lesson plants itself one night and returns every winter, and a person who grows up with it finds modern rooms easier to fix because the logic never changed. In the Southwest, alignment with the sun appears in mundane chores rather than cosmic charts. A white plaster wall on the south turns afternoon light into warmth, and then slowly gives it back after dusk when hands are tired and mouths want a patient stew. Kivas deepen the airflow lesson by adding a deflector between fresh air and the fire. The current strengthens because the flame is not imbued by a cold blast, and smoke obeys the pull to the roof vent rather than wandering across the floor, which is robust physics dressed as tradition. Builders argue about how early these alignments became formal, and the result is an honest split. One position sees careful planning long before detailed records. The other sees a long run of practice that became explicit later. Both still walk into rooms that feel right on winter nights. Back in the far north, a lamp gives light low in a room, and that matters to tired eyes. The glow comes from a horizon rather than a harsh point, and shadows soften across tools and skins, which lowers strain and raises endurance without anyone saying the word ergonomics. The lamp also dries gear in a controlled band that keeps mildew at bay. Robes and boots hang where warmth rises without scorching, and the small daily victories show up as quieter joints and longer-lasting stitching, which is comfort expressed as durability. In cedar plank houses, the ridge space behaves like a reservoir. Heat rises there with some smoke and then drifts back down in a wide, slow pour that ignores gusts at the eaves, and a person can carve, weave, or tell a story without chasing a moving patch of comfort. On damp nights when smoke resists the vent, families reduce the flame, adjust a board, and accept a little haze for the sake of dry beams. That trade preserves the structure and the people, and the cost is measured in an extra story told, while the stew waits one more minute. Stone boiling returns with an extra benefit people still overlook. Heated water cleans tools and hands in a room that would otherwise draw moisture out of skin so fast that cracks appear, and a small routine of warm rinses prevents trouble at medicine-laden names and invoices. Fuel selection stands as a quiet science in places where wood is scarce. On the plains, bison chips burn with a steady glow and few sparks, so they suit low tents and soft bedding far better than lath and branch, and that property is recorded in calm sleep rather than in a headline. Greasewood and sage twist quickly into heat and equally quickly away, so cooks blend them with slower coals to flatten temperature. The logic makes a steel pot behave on a windy day and also makes a basket boil on a sheltered one, which is the same math with different tools. Driftwood offers resin-rich pieces after storms, and families sort them on the bank by size and dryness. Big sections become benches and planks. Medium splits make a stable fuel. Little bits become tomorrow's first smiles of flame, and a river that breaks trees does half the hauling. Storage grows from that sorting with a social side effect. Fuel piles reveal the week ahead at a glance and announce whether a neighbor could use a hand, and lending a bundle saves more than calories because it keeps a circle from fraying in hard weather. All of these choices revolve around one promise and one question that drive the winter. The promise is that a small, well-guided fire can run a household. The question is what to adjust when the sky changes in 10 minutes, and the payoff is the day saved without a drama. A compact recap carries us forward with the thread intact. We have seen houses teach flames to behave, and flames teach rooms to respond, and we now ask how these habits fared when towns spread grids across valleys and lumberyards replaced riverbanks. Grids brought building codes, and codes brought uniform walls that did not know local wind. Families kept sneaking wisdom into the gaps by hanging inner liners, shading south walls in summer and banking snow in winter, and the result was a modern rectangle that quietly remembered older curves. Teachers at boarding schools sometimes banned old house forms and then wondered why children coughed. The same teachers later allowed quilts on inner frames and pots by stoves because attendance and sleep improved, which is data even if no one plotted a chart. Doctors noticed the patterns and wrote about humidity and fresh air without smoke. They did not credit grandmothers with deflectors and simmering pots, but they recommended devices that did the same work with new names, and health followed the practice rather than the vocabulary. There is a quiet pleasure in watching language catch up with practice. What a builder today calls passive design and zoned comfort looks like a tippy liner and a cold trap in new clothes, and the clever part is not the naming but the persistence. A visitor from a city apartment might stand in an adobe room and ask why the window is small. The answer is that winter sun is low and kind, summer sun is high and rude, and the wall knows the difference in a way a person can feel without a meter. On the prairie, a child once learned to hear dryness in a chip and now listens for leakiness in a window frame with the same ear. The skill moved from one material to another because the need did not change, and a draft under a sill steals heat the same way as a hole under a cover. In the Arctic, a hunter sets a lamp lower for a long night and trims the wick as the room warms. The work is careful, the reward is steady, and the lesson reads as energy literacy kept in a bowl rather than on a bill. In the plateau, a winter household places baskets of roots near the cool trap and lays out beadwork in the warm band. That zoning prevents spoilage and squinting, and the plan emerges without a drawing because the house speaks the map in temperature instead of ink. When metal and glass arrive cheaper, the temptation is to abandon the slow room craft. The consequence is often high bills, dry throats, and a living space that feels like standing near a blast furnace in a draft, which is exciting for 10 minutes and tiring for 10 hours. The counter move costs less than a trip to a store. Hang in a curtain, use a screen behind a chair, adjust door habits to bundle drafts, and move the simmering pot back into your life, and the room begins to act as if it remembers how to help. Where laws allowed, some families built masonry heaters that echoed old mass logic. A short hot fire warmed channels in brick or stone, and the heater then released that warmth all day, which felt suspiciously like an earth lodge with a chimney and a clock. Even when masonry was not allowed, tricks still fit. A row of water jugs near a stove picked up heat and gave it back later, and a shelf moved a bed into the warm band while leaving the floor cool enough for storage, which transformed the same cubic feet into a smarter layout. A final test for this part lies in a storm that shifts twice before midnight. In the room with edits, the flap or curtain moves once, the fire drops to coals, and people keep reading. In the room with only bright flame, wood disappears and the temperature still yo-yos, and people give up on everything but tending. The difference is not heroic, it is cumulative. 1,000 small choices in a season produce a calm winter and a healthier spring, and the house that learns with its people becomes a partner in the kind of comfort older viewers recognize as real rather than advertised. What lingers after the fire fades is the feeling that warmth was designed rather than shouted. The design was made from liners, mass, traps, lamps, stones, embers, and mats arranged to cooperate. And that cooperation outlasted weather, catalogues, and fashion in a way anyone can verify by simply sitting down and noticing where their shoulders relax. We will keep following these ideas into farms, towns, and new materials where the same physics plays a familiar tune. The open question now is how these 7 working hacks reshape daily life beyond winter nights, because a warm house does not just save wood, it changes what a family can plan and accomplish. Warm rooms changed the clock because fewer hours went to chasing fuel and more went to work that built value. A winter day turned into blocks of carving, sewing, and knot tying that could run without stiff fingers or scattered attention. A tip with a curved backrest and a steady coal bed turned a bench into a workspace where sinew split cleanly and beads did not bounce from cold hands. That single shift lifted the quality of tools and clothing, and quality returns as fewer repairs later. When earth lodges held an even temperature, drying racks for meat and roots stayed predictable. Women could plan batches of food with less waste, and men could fit bow making between chores because the glue set the same way each day. A pit house with a cold trap kept winter storage safer because the cool tier near the door held baskets like a pantry. The warm ledges kept bedding dry, and the split zones stopped food from stealing heat from people who needed rest. Lamp-heated rooms in the Arctic lengthened productive hours without smoke that made eyes water. Children learned to read the lamp by color and hiss, and a steady blue meant cooking and mending could run until the day's work was honestly finished. Stone boiling and hot stones in bedding made sleep deeper and mornings quicker. A body that rests well makes better judgments about travel and hunting, and that discipline shows up in safer trips and steadier larders. Banked embers removed the frantic minutes at dawn that break a plan before it starts. A parent lifted a glow, fed it a twist of bark, and the day began with tea rather than with a scramble that woke the whole house into a bad mood. Modular insulation made rooms social because people could gather without storm-winning the conversation. Tula mats or cedar bark liners went up in an hour, and the same home that felt drafty at noon felt like a meeting hall by dusk. Seasonal ceremonies often clustered in winter, not because of romance, but because the engineering allowed people to sit and listen. A room that holds warmth for the length of a story changes how a community remembers itself, and memory stored in comfort tends to be kept. Markets formed in the same logic. A winter fair near a sheltered bend drew trade because people could stand to bargain beside an earth lodge vent, and the nearby houses provided steady kitchens for visitors who brought news along with fur and tools. When iron stoves arrived in the mid-19th century, families did not simply replace the old hearth. They set the stove inside a mass or behind a screen and treated it like a strong but impatient helper that needed restraint to serve the same calm goal. Fuel budgets became visible in ledgers at trading posts because wood, chips, and oil had prices. The households that used liners, traps, and mass spent less for the same comfort, and those savings showed up as extra staples when storms shut river traffic. Health followed the room, and the details were ordinary and real. Humid air from simmering pots reduced throat irritation. Even temperatures eased joint. Fewer sudden chills meant fewer fevers that might otherwise spread through a camp in a week. Doctors later wrote about ventilation and humidity as if they were new concepts. Families had already been practicing both in kivas with deflectors and in lodges with smoke flaps, and a good night of sleep quietly beat the clinic bill. Education in winter depended on light and endurance. A lamp with a trimmed wick gave even glow and gentle heat, and children traced syllables while elders repaired tools, which made literacy and craftsmanship share the same room. Music and stories stretched when rooms worked. A steady gradient let a drum hold tone and a voice carry without strain, and a long narrative could be told fully instead of in short fragments that conceded to cold. Trade goods that only winter could make gained polish. Beadwork, quillwork, and carved bowls benefited from calm hands and predictable drying, and the best pieces moved far along trails because excellence asks for no translator. Fuel gathering became a measured habit rather than a daily emergency. Families collected bison chips or driftwood methodically and kept them dry, and storage piles turned into winter equity that could be loaned or traded without drama. Loaning fuel drew social lines that mattered. A neighbor with a thin pile received a bundle and repaid in work or meat later, and the trust attached to that exchange made the next storm less lonely. Travel decisions changed under this thermal peace. A hunter left with warm boots and returned to a room that did not steal heat from exhausted muscles, and the hunt stayed about skill rather than about whether a fire could be bullied into kindness. On rivers during freeze-up, crews used heated stones under robes to keep grip and judgment. A boat that kept hands steady made better choices at bends, and the cargo reached markets that otherwise would have waited for spring. Resource maps widened because a warm base camp made long processing tasks tolerable. Groups could roast roots in earth pits all day and sort them on warm ground above, then carry the results home to storage without rush and waste. The hinge between old and new sharpened in mission towns. Standard cottages often leaked and required constant stoking, so families quietly added inner liners, door curtains, and small mass around stoves until the square boxes behaved more like the round rooms that had worked. Officials sometimes read these edits as resistance. The households read them as prudence, and the winter told which side had the better plan by counting who slept and who coughed. Arguments among historians over exact adoption dates of canvas, iron, or window glass continue because records differ by valley and year. One position tracks fast adoption in trade-rich corridors, while another shows stubborn local blends that outlasted catalogue trends, and both appear in the same decade depending on supply. The consequence is clear even if the timeline wavers. Methods that used air and mass wisely outperformed bright flames alone, and the families who kept those habits fared better when woodcarts ran late. Clothing and housing worked together like gears. Robes with guard hairs outfaced sparks while underfur trapped air inside, and beds were placed to catch radiant heat on the chest because people sleep best when their backs and hands are not stealing warmth from the air. Children learned to hear a draft by the rattle of a pot lid and to see a bad seal by the glitter of frost near the floor. Those senses moved with them into board houses and tenements, where a rolled rug at a sill or a quilt hung as a liner kept a little room from eating a paycheck. In the southwest, passive solar habits made farming calendars safer. Adobe held the night, small south windows welcomed winter sun, and pre-dawn chores started in rooms that did not punish hands, so water hauling and corn grinding began on time. Kivas illustrated energy literacy in a few simple pieces. Fresh air entered low, a stone deflected the rush, the flame drew true, and smoke left cleanly through a roof, which allowed gatherings to run without headache while people discussed crops and obligations. On the northwest coast, cedar plank houses protected work that needed dryness. Planks sealed in rain, vents adjusted, and racks kept fish and gear in the right band of heat, so a week of storms could not undo a season of labor. In the plateau, side entry tunnels in pit houses made visits calmer. Cold air pooled away from beds, words moved without shivering, and decisions about travel and hunting were made with steady minds rather than with a chorus of chattering teeth. The Arctic lamp taught attention to detail as a survival trait. A wick trimmed too long smoked and wasted oil. A wick trimmed too short starved the flame. and the person who learned the exact length used less fuel for the same comfort and had more left for long trips. Banks of snow were enlisted as exterior insulation across many regions. People pushed drifts against windward walls, and that neat act lowered infiltration so visibly that children could feel the floor stop biting their ankles before supper ended. Stone boiling made more than dinner. It cleaned air, added humidity, softened hides, and gave infants warm water without sparks, so one practice delivered several benefits and saved fuel compared to running an open flame for every task. The same stones traveled to beds in the evening. Wrapped and placed near feet, they provided steady heat all night, and they made morning joints less stiff in elders who then walked farther and taught longer. Fuel choice set the tone in treeless country. Bison chips burned without sparks and with steady coals, which fit low shelters and wool robes far better than bark that snapped into trouble. Greasewood and sage burned fast and hot, so cooks blended them with slow coals for even temperature. The result was fewer scorched pots and fewer undercooked meals, which saves wood, nerves, and apologies. Driftwood brought pitch-rich pieces after storms that split into perfect sticks. Families learned to read wood by smell and sheen, and a winter pile arranged by size and resin content functioned like a planned pantry. Iron stoves demanded rules to enter this system politely. Screens and jackets changed to point, burn into a wide comfort. Dampers kept chimneys from stealing heat, and a pot kept at the edge returned the missing humidity until breathing felt normal again. Boarding schools tried to mandate one heating style and learned something practical instead. Attendance rose and coughs fell when rooms adopted inner liners and kept simmering kettles, and those changes looked suspiciously like the same 7 ideas in new materials. Some communities built masonry heaters once brick and stone were cheap and codes allowed. A short evening fire heated channels and masts that released warmth all day, and people reported waking to comfortable rooms without feeding the fire at night. Where codes banned mass near stoves, households improvised with water jugs and thick shelves. The water buffered swings, the shelf lifted beds into the warm band, and the floor stayed cooler for storage without wasting space. Gardens benefited because arrested body plants straight arose. Seedlings started near gentle heat sprouted evenly, and vegetables dried for storage kept quality when racks sat in stable air, rather than in rooms that soared between hot and cold. Hunting plans improved because warmth changed logistics. People could butcher and dry meat without rush, tend hides without cracking, and pack gear without losing hours to reheating stiff hands, which meant fewer trips and less waste. Trade routes favored villages with reliable winter hospitality. Travelers knew where a warm bench and a steady pot waited, and goods moved through those hubs with fewer delays, which made those places richer without a mine or a mill. Conflicts over timber and fuel use arose when settlers and agencies set quotas or cut rights. Communities respond by leaning harder on liners, cold traps, and stone heat, and they kept their own fuel under lock and goodwill rather than under policy alone. Archaeology reads these changes in soot and ash. Sites with well-tuned vents show clean ledges and dark throat rings, while places that lost the craft have soot spread evenly to the floor, and those rooms tell a story of comfort or struggle without a single diary entry. Ethnographers captured regional arguments in compact sentences that still guide debate. Some said canvas covers changed everything on the plains. Others said the airflow habits mattered more than the skin, and both sides show evidence from camps in the same season with different supply lines. The daily lesson for anyone listening is durable. A small, controlled source plus a thoughtful envelope beats a big, noisy source alone, and the difference shows up in budgets, health, and the number of stories completed before bed. Modern homes can borrow without pretending to travel back in time. Inner curtains act like liners. Bookcases and water tanks add mass. Door habits create cold traps, and a cheap screen behind a chair returns heat to a chest as well as any carved willow. The funniest test stays the simplest. Move your seat 2 feet, place a throw as a reflector, and discover that comfort comes more from position and pattern than from a louder flame, which is the same discovery that made winter work possible in rooms built from grass, earth, stone, and cedar. As towns spread in the late 19th century, these ideas moved into churches, schools, and meeting halls. Builders lowered winter ceilings, added vestibules to trap cold air, and placed stoves inside brick jackets, and ordinary people just enjoyed longer meetings without headaches. Railroads brought coal and sheet metal, and families chose what to accept and what to ignore. They bought an iron stove, then kept the kettle in the quilt liner, and the result did not look fashionable on a postcard, but felt right on a Wednesday night. The 7 hacks also shaped law in subtle ways. Towns that lost trees to fast cutting learned to regulate fuel while praising insulation, and the ordinances nodded to safety while the households nodded to thrift, which kept the peace between a rulebook and a cold sky. A brief recap keeps the thread tight for the last stretch tonight. Warm rooms extended work, saved fuel, improved health, supported trade, and taught generations to see heat as design rather than as spectacle. And the open question is how those designs adapted when power lines and modern codes arrived. That next chapter begins when kerosene and electricity changed light, while wood and coal remain the heat. Families kept the 7 habits under the new glow, and the rooms stayed familiar even as wires hummed, which shows how a good plan survives new tools without giving up its soul. Power lines changed the night before they changed the heat. Families flipped a switch and saw sewing and reading extend, then fed the same modest fire they had trusted because wires did not yet make rooms warm by themselves. Kerosene lamps moved to shelves while stoves stayed in the center, like stubborn friends. The quiet habits persisted under the new light because comfort still came from how air moved, where mass sat, and how carefully a flame was asked to behave. In many agency-built cottages, square rooms and standard chimneys arrived with optimism. People nodded, then hung inner quilts as liners, added door curtains, and slipped a pot of water near the stove edge until the room felt like a partner instead of a drafty box. Some called those edits old-fashioned, and then asked why the coffee eased and the woodpile lasted. The answer sat in the 7 working ideas that had not retired, because liners, mass, traps, lamps or low flames, hot stones, banked embers, and movable insulation do not check passports. A Navajo family in a round log and earth hogan faced the door to the east for light and order. The low roof, central hearth, and thick walls made a calm envelope, and morning sun reached the floor while a small fire held steady against cold that rode desert wind. A neighbor tried a boxed stove on open boards and found the air sharp and the rhythm jumpy. He then placed adobe around the iron, hung a blanket as an inner skirt, and discovered that the old circle had been teaching the new square how not to be rude. Electric heaters entered stores like gadgets from a fair. People learned quickly that a glowing coil without a plan drank coins and gave bone-dry air, so they put a screen behind a chair, kept the kettle on low, and used the device as grace notes rather than as the orchestra. On icy reservations where fuel money ran thin, elders leaned harder on banking embers. A hot heart under ash meant dawn tea from a patient glow, and that first cup started decisions from a steady place instead of from a scramble. Schoolhouses built to a template began to borrow older tricks after a few winters with tired children. Vestibules trapped cold air, ceilings were lowered for winter assemblies, and stoves received brick or stone jackets, which turned fidget into attention without adding a single new lecture. The pattern repeated in churches and town halls where winter events mattered. Side rooms held simmering pots, interior curtains came down after spring, and the same rooms felt spacious in summer and kindly in snow without moving a wall. Historians argue about when each region adopted these blended methods because records are uneven. One position shows fast uptake in rail-served towns, while another shows quiet persistence of local envelopes alongside new appliances. And the safe summary is that people kept what worked and trimmed what did not. A recap helps the eye as the century turns. Electricity lit hands, iron cooked fast, and the 7 hacks kept the air gentle and the budget sane, which made winter feel like a solvable problem rather than a season-long emergency. Engineers arrived with notebooks and new words for old logic. They measured air changes and radiant fractions, then published diagrams that looked like tippy liners and Kiva deflectors drawn by rulers, and the families nodded because the diagrams finally spoke their language. Weatherization programs later offered storm windows and caulk, and households added those to quilts and mats. The stack of small edits made a rectangle behave like a lodge, and the fuel truck visited less often while the house rested more often. On the northwest coast, plank houses became framed houses, but cedar logic kept a seat. People seasoned boards, vented low on damp days, and kept racks in a warm band that preserved gear, and the new houses smelled like wood and steady cooking rather than like paint. In the plains, canvas went out and tar paper came in on some homes, and both aged poorly without the liner gap. Families who kept an inner curtain and tuned the smoke path reported better sleep and fewer red eyes, which is not a romance but a measurement made with eyelids. The Arctic lamp met kerosene and later met wires, but attention stayed the core skill. A wick trimmed to clean blue remained the sign of thrift, and even with new fuel or light, the room still depended on watching edges where warm meets cold. Hot stones made a quiet comeback as bed warmers when electricity became expensive. People heated bricks or soapstone on stoves, wrapped them, and slid them to the foot of beds, and the small comfort turned into a better morning in a way a receipt never captures. Masonry heaters appeared where codes allowed and budgets cooperated. A short hot fire each evening warmed a dense core, and that core released heat for a day with no fuss, which felt like the old earth lodge dressed for town. Where masonry was barred, water did the same job in bottles along a stove wall. The thermal buffer took peaks and smoothed valleys, and the room stopped acting like a bell that only knew how to ring loud or not at all. Humor threaded the edits because pride and comfort take turns. A visitor praised a modern heater and found himself quietly moved to a seat with a backrest and a throw, and he discovered that humans are radiant panels when placed correctly. Agricultural calendars benefited when homes stayed even. Seedlings started indoors did not shock as they went outside, drying herbs did not mold, and winter hands reached spring soil without cracks that made work miserable. Traders noticed that towns with comfortable winter rooms drew customers. People lingered to buy, swap news, and mend gear, and money moved with warmth because no one shops well while shivering. Doctors documented fewer respiratory issues in rooms with controlled humidity and better ventilation. The words changed by decade, but the practice stayed the same because a simmering pot and a well-set vent do not argue with the throat. Schools quietly kept kettles near stoves and taught children to close doors against cold traps. The habit became civic rather than private, and a building learned manners that reduced bills without debates about ideology. Agencies tried to mandate window sizes and stove types without always accounting for wind and altitude. Families answered with quilts, mats, vestibules, and mass wherever possible, and the rooms behaved while forms were filled out in colder offices. A small test people used required no instruments. Sit 2 feet closer to a wall with a throw behind you and watch how a small heater feels larger, then move your chair into the draft and learn physics in a minute, which is a respectful course in energy literacy. Radio arrived and made winter social in new ways. Warm rooms held neighbors who wanted to listen together, and the same principles that saved wood now saved batteries and patience during long broadcasts. In the southwest, passive solar logic welcomed glass when it became available. Small south-facing windows grew in number but not in size. White plaster stayed, and exterior shading grew in summer, which kept the winter gift without inviting summer glare. In timber towns, sawdust and scrap fed tight fires when logs were too valuable to waste. People learned to mix fine and coarse fuel as if it were flour and grain, and the stove purred rather than flared, which saved both patience and chimneys. A recap keeps our compass steady. New fuels and devices arrived, but comfort still came from guiding air, shaping mass, trapping cold, tending steady flames, storing heat in stone, carrying tomorrow's ember, and editing walls by the day, which is a tidy way to manage a wild sky. Mid-century aluminum storms and fiberglass insulation offered speed, but families still added the human edits. A blanket liner hung in an afternoon changes a week, and a door curtain buys silence at ankle level every time someone forgets to close behind them. The 7 hacks also guided repair after disaster. When roofs blew off or floods soaked walls, people rebuilt first the parts that control air and water, then set a modest heater at the center, and the room began to heal like a patient whose breath has steadied. Wartime rationing made fuel careful again. Households banked coals like savings, kept kettles on low for multiple jobs, and moved chairs rather than flames, and the constraint taught a generation to notice comfort as a designed outcome rather than as a noisy accident. In the late 20th century, improved stoves added secondary burns and baffles. They used wood more completely, but they still worked best inside rooms that had liners, humidity, and drafts tamed, which shows that a clever box without a clever shell is only half a plan. Community centers on reservations began to use vestibules and low winter ceilings even in modern frames. The rooms hosted meetings without fogged windows and without the seesaw of heat that ruins focus, and decisions improved because attention could last. Elders kept teaching small tests that reveal leaks without instruments. A feather hung by a door, a candle near a vent, a hand at a liner edge, and a kettle lid that sings when a draft sneaks in made the invisible visible, and repairs followed the song. Some households adopted rocket mass heaters where rules allowed, and the old truth showed up again. A hot pulse through a maze of mass yielded a day of warmth, and the fuel pile shrank while chairs drifted to the places where the radiant band felt kindest. Elsewhere, small space heaters became safer and gained thermostats. They still dried air when used as sole heat and still rose in cost with each hour, so they returned to their best role as helpers guided by pots, screens, and liners. There is a temptation to see these habits as exotic rather than practical. The right word is transferable because a quilt liner hung in a New England rental works for the same reasons as a liner in a tippy, and a door sock makes as much sense in a city as in a canyon. Modern energy audits sometimes deliver what grandmothers already knew. Raise the sleeping surface, create a cold trap at the entry, add mass near the heater, and control humidity, and the meter falls while the shoulders drop, which is the graph everyone actually wants. Young builders began to repackage the old ideas as passive houses and super-insulated shells. That language helps codes and finance, and the physics is the same as the 7 hacks that tuned comfort long before spreadsheets, which is a pleasant kind of agreement. Cultural programs that restore traditional structures now highlight thermal wisdom as much as ceremony. Visitors feel the steady climate and notice the lamp glow or the calm fire, and the lesson travels home as a practical edit rather than as a souvenir. Families who juggle electric bills in cold snaps still rotate chairs and throws before they touch the thermostat. The rotation costs nothing and often saves enough to make the month feel possible, which is a respectable outcome from a 2-minute rearrangement. In northern forests, pellet stoves appeared with tidy bags and augers. People still set kettles on top and still placed reflectors behind favorite seats, because gadgets do not erase the body's love of radiant comfort, and even machines enjoy a good supporting cast. Town builders rediscovered vestibules and called them airlocks in bright brochures. A small room between street and hall kept heat inside, and the brochures congratulated themselves while elders smiled at the familiar shape. A brief recap holds our through line as the lights hum. Devices improved, codes thickened, and yet comfort kept obeying the same 7 habits that make small fires act like steady engines. And the open question is how these lessons scale to neighborhoods and regions that hope to save energy without sacrificing winter evenings. That question points to district heating, shared spaces, and building placement that cooperates with sun and wind. The next scenes follow those wider patterns as they meet local rooms, because a warm neighborhood begins with a warm bench and a kettle that never has to raise its voice. Neighborhood warmth began with where people put the first house and which way the door faced. A settlement that turned its back to the bitter wind and its face to the low sun started every day as if it had already made 2 good choices. Plains winter camps tucked into river bends where bluffs cut the north wind and wood or chips were close. That sighting meant the liner and flap did not have to fight the full sky, and a modest fire stayed modest because the land was helping. Villages along the Missouri set earth lodges in rings that created courtyards which calmed gusts. Horses and people moved on packed paths that stayed drier, while smoke lifted in thin lines that did not shred in crosswind, and the whole place behaved like a single careful room. On the northwest coast, rows of cedar plank houses faced the water and the light, and the beach itself acted as a radiant surface on clear days. The houses stood shoulder to shoulder, and their shared bulk slowed wind in the lane between them, so a small hearth could carry a long evening. In the Arctic, snow houses rose in clusters with low passages that formed a town of insulated tunnels. A family could visit without exposing faces to wind for long, and the heat from bodies and lamps softened cold in the passages enough that frost wrote faint maps on the walls. Historians argue whether some village orientations were driven more by defense or by weather. One position stresses watch lines and palisade angles, while another points to windroses and sun paths. And the truth in many places is that safety and comfort were planned together. The 7 hacks scaled to the neighborhood in quiet ways that anyone could see after a storm. Snow was thrown against windward walls in a ritual that looked like cleanup but was really community insulation, and the same drift kept creeping around corners where elders wanted it. Shared workspaces were placed in the warm band of the village the same way a bed sits in the warm band of a room. Fish racks, hide frames, and root sorting mats lived where wind was tamed, and radiant reflections from house walls helped without smoke being anywhere near the task. A small procession of fires replaced one huge bonfire because distribution beats spectacle. Several hearths tucked behind reflectors made more comfort with less fuel than one noisy blaze in the open, and the only drama came from stories that did not need to shout. Doors gained modest vestibules that caught cold like a gutter catches rain. 2 quick coverings in series kept the main room calmer, and children learned the habit as a game that also saved wood in a way ledgers later discovered. Paths became part of the thermal plan when they were brushed or floored with mats. A dry foot arrives at its task warmer and smarter, and the minutes saved by not wrestling mud or ice turn into the hour you wanted for mending or trade. Windbreaks at the edge of a village worked the same math as a liner inside a room. Willow fences, brush walls, and even stacked fish weirs made slipstreams that lowered the bite of gusts, and the fires downwind needed less coaxing. When bodies gathered for council or trade, the seating mat respected radiant physics without speeches. Elders took benches with backrests and walls at their shoulders. The entry was buffered by a screen, and the heat of conversation did the rest without asking a fireplace to prove a point. Food preparation used neighborhood heat like a shared tool. Earth ovens warmed the ground for hours, and the family could set baskets on the warm crust and salt while the meal cooked below, which turned fuel into community comfort twice. At river crossings where people met strangers, temporary shelters borrowed the same rules. Covers were pegged tight to a low frame, flaps faced away from prevailing wind, and a reflecting wall of brush returned heat to sitting chests, like a courtesy extended to guests. Arguments about whether plaza size in Pueblo towns was ritual or practical show up in field notes. One camp says ceremony set the scale, while another says winter sun angles and wind lanes set the width. And both agree that people learned to place benches where warmth and sound cooperated. Trading posts changed flow and introduced square rooms that leaked in 4 tidy directions. Families brought back liners and inner curtains, and the post owner who watched carefully added vestibules and lowered winter ceilings because customers stayed longer when shoulders relaxed. Neighborhood clinics and schoolhouses repeated the pattern. A small entry trapped cold, stoves were jacketed with brick, water simmered on the edge for humidity, and attendance rose on days when the sky would have otherwise run out of sheer persistence. Fuel commons were treated like banks because winter interest rates are steep. Driftwood piles were sorted by size, chip caches were kept dry under brush, and borrowing a bundle came with the promise of labor or food later, which kept the ledger balanced without sour looks. Shared storage respected the temperature map of streets as carefully as a pantry respects a cold trap. Root cellars opened on the downwind side of alleys. Smoked fish hung where lanes stayed dry, and people knew by feel which corner came alive with warmth as the sun tilted. In tight valleys, villages used the land as a heat shield by building against rock outcrops. The stone held afternoon sun and bled it back into alleys at dusk, and you could warm your palm on a wall like you greet an old friend who keeps good hours. On high mesas, towns sheltered behind low walls that did 3 jobs by looking like one. The walls kept out the worst gusts, held snowdrifts where they would help, and reflected low winter sun into rooms that needed it, which is a lot of work for a line of stones. When iron stoves became common, communal spaces tempered them with mass and distance. Stoves stood inside low masonry islands. Benches were placed for radiant comfort rather than for a view of the flame, and noise settled as the air stopped you yowing. Doctors in mission settlements noted that coughs fell when humidity rose gently in shared rooms. They did not cite stone boiling and simmering pots by name, but their journals described the same practice in clinical terms, and the residents kept doing what worked while the words caught up. Night watch in winter used hot stones and modest coal beds to make stations bearable. A watcher walked a short circuit and returned to a wrapped stone by a lee wall that returned sensation to fingers, and better judgment followed close behind. River towns raked sand into warm pads after community earth oven days. People sat on those quiet radiators to repair nets and mend clothing, and by the time the sand cooled, the work was done and the meal was ready. which is productive timing disguised as comfort. Historians debate how quickly rail towns adopted vestibules and inner liners because photographs hide the edits. One side points to fast adoption in company buildings, while another shows home-made liners and brush windbreaks long after, and both find the same felt truth in diaries that praise a room when it behaves. A recap for the wider lens keeps the core simple. Villages arranged wind, sun, paths, and shared heat on purpose, and the 7 hacks scaled from rooms to blocks so that small fires stayed small and people stayed productive. Power lines arrived and invited new habits without replacing old ones. Neighborhood gatherings moved under electric light, but the rooms still used mass, liners, vestibules, and calm flames, and the budget still thanked those choices in wood and in coins. Street layouts that bent with wind taught a sly lesson to town planners. A gentle curve can deny a gale the straight run it loves, and if a bend saves every door 1 stick of wood a day, that curve buys more books than a bright slogan ever could. In subarctic posts where kerosene was precious, lamps burned low in rooms that had been thickened by quilts and mats. The glow stayed steady because the building was doing its share, and a heavy hand on the wick became a mark of inexperience rather than of prosperity. A riverfront lined with plank houses acted like a large radiator on winter afternoons. The sun hit the boards, the warmth drifted into lanes behind, and children learned the microclimate by where they chose to play while adults pretended not to notice their own smart feet. Rail yards piled ties and scrap the community sometimes used as fuel under watchful eyes. Stoves ran with a mix that demanded baffles and dampers to avoid sparks, and so brick jackets and water pots became standard in rooms where ties burned, which kept the warmth but not the hazard. Public baths and washhouses in some towns adapted pit house logic without citation. Entrances dropped into cooler rooms where wet work happened, warm benches wrapped a central hearth, and steam rose in measured quantities that cleaned lungs instead of punishing them. When agencies pushed standard houses with no vestibules, people built small porches and closed them in winter with mats or boards. The porches became cold traps for boots and buckets, and the main room stopped spilling its warmth out the front like a careless storekeeper. Markets that thrived in winter learned to host warmth the way a good store hosts light. Vendors sat behind low reflectors, a shared oven made a wide, warm zone, and trade moved because customers can count prices better when they can feel their fingers. One town set a rule to shovel snow against the windward side of public buildings. The rule sounded like tidiness and played like insulation, and the salt budget dropped while the comment card box stayed quiet because walking into comfort leaves nothing to complain about. Farmsteads borrowed the village plan by planting windbreaks on 3 sides and leaving the south open. The grove slowed storms, snow drifted where it helped instead of where it hurt, and the house needed fewer heroic fires to keep its promise. When a school added a double door, a pot by the stove, and a brick jacket, a teacher wrote that winter recitations lengthened by minutes. Those minutes added up to hours by spring, and the test scores followed in a way that made an educational reformer sit down and ask about kettles. Debates about whether Pueblo Terrace Heights were designed mainly for defense or for sun stepped back into the same split. One view holds that watch and wall ruled, another that solar comfort shaped steps, and the daily lived result is terraces that warm and shelter at the same time when winter comes. Fisher towns placed smokehouses where prevailing breezes would pull fumes away without stealing heat. The buildings spread that warmth into alleys where hands worked on nets, and the sound of knives on fish became a winter metronome that did not rush. People treated ice as a building material where it stayed long enough, and lanes were cut to favor slow turns that kept gusts from driving straight through. A careful corner costs nothing and makes life better, and it is the street version of a deflector stone by a hearth. Modern planners call these moves microclimate design and publish proof with numbers. Elders call them winter sense and show proof by walking you to the warm bench and not explaining until you notice, which keeps both pride and circulation intact. Refuse and scrap served as ad hoc insulation when money was tight. Brush, reed bundles, and even salvage boards leaned against foundations and vanished behind snow within a day, and the rooms they protected kept breath in a kind of band. Community centres on reservations that adopted vestibules, low winter ceilings, and mass surround stoves became winter living rooms for towns. Meetings ran longer without fogged windows or restless feet, and the ratio of decision to complaint improved in a way that even a skeptic can learn to enjoy. Factories that hired local carpenters heard about inner liners and tried them on work floors. Output rose on cold weeks because hands stayed warm, and the payroll clerk discovered the 7 hacks in the column that pays for coffee. Folders from agencies once insisted that window size alone controlled comfort. Years later, the same offices funded vestibules, insulation and ventilation baffles, and the circular path of wisdom sat politely while the rooms acted right the whole time. A recap for the ledger-minded viewer keeps the numbers friendly. Align sighting with wind and sun, trap cold at entrances, share heat with mass and reflectors, and move people through warm bands rather than through air that has to be heated again from scratch, and the tally smiles. Blackouts taught even modern towns why mass and embers matter. A masonry heater or a brick jacket held warmth when wires quit. Hot stones in beds bought hours of rest, and water kept on a low heat before the grid failed made a difference that did not need an advertisement. Families taught children a small test that works at village scale. If a street feels like a bellows, bend it with a fence or a hedge. If a hall coughs heat out the door, give it a pocket to collect itself. And if a heater feels too proud, make it share its work with brick and with patience. Contemporary builders who listen are now placing houses with more attention to wind and sun in cold districts. They add vestibules as standard, place mass near heaters, and shape blocks to favor calm lanes, and the residents report that winter feels less like a fight and more like a routine. Some scholars argue that modern insulation and sealed windows make the old hacks redundant. Others reply that the hacks teach where to put the sealed envelope and how to shape flow inside it, and the residents who sleep well tend to join the second group without writing a paper about it. A gentle shift toward district heat in a few towns echoes the old shared hearth idea. A central plant runs efficiently while buildings add liners, mass, and vestibules, and the system succeeds because the demand is reasonable rather than reckless. Even where district systems are out of reach, shared winter spaces serve the same logic. A library with a brick-jacketed stove and calm air can be the warm bench for a block, and the savings appear in fewer emergency calls and in more pages turned. Emergency planning now quietly includes hot stone kits and low-tech ember carry pots in some cold places. The line items look small and old-fashioned, and they work when a storm drags a modern grid into yesterday in the span of a gust. Public health programs that once focused only on fuel now mention humidity and ventilation. They place simmering pots or small humidifiers where air is too dry, teach deflector placement in community rooms, and watch seasonal illness drop a notch that matters. Tour centers that demonstrate traditional houses are beginning to present the thermal story as a practical class. Visitors feel a liner do its work, see a deflector shape a flame, and watch a stone warm a bed, and they walk out with tips rather than with only photographs. The craft side flourishes because it makes life better to hold the tools that shape comfort. Basket makers teach stone boiling, woodworkers carve backrests that behave like silent radiators, and mat weavers show how a layer placed well beats a louder fire without asking for applause. A reminder as we near the last turn returns us to the core. The 7 hacks are not relics but habits that cooperate with wind, sun, and rooms to turn small fires into steady engines, and the open question is how to carry them into homes that want lower bills and kinder winters without losing the grace that made them work in the first place. The next scenes will seal that promise with specific steps for modern rooms that borrow the old sense without the costume. A dwelling can keep electricity, safety codes, and comfort while gaining liners, mass, traps, stones, embers, and movable skins, and the payoff will read in quiet nights rather than in loud heaters. A modern winter room starts to behave the minute you give it an inner skin. Hang a simple fabric liner on a light frame an inch off the wall, close it near the floor, and the draft stops treating your ankles like a target. The idea is the tippy liner in new clothes. Warm air rises in the hidden gap, cold air slides harmlessly below, and the living zone settles into a calm that a louder heater never achieved. Use what you own because the material matters less than the pattern. Quilts, smoothing blankets, or heavy curtains on a cheap track create the envelope, and the room answers in one evening with quieter air and slower heat loss. A quick recap keeps the purpose honest. You're not decorating but shaping flow so a small heater can act like a steady engine, and your fuel bill stops acting like a cliff. Next, build a cold trap at the entrance so every arrival is not a gale. A narrow vestibule, a hung curtain, or a short screen in front of the door catches the burst, and the rest of the room does not have to start over every time someone forgets their gloves. That pocket can be as humble as a coat rack and a second curtain. The physics does not demand applause, only a pause, and the payoff is minutes of comfort saved without spending a coin. Floor comfort comes from breaking the handshake with cold ground. Lay a rug with a thin pad, raise the main seat a few inches, and the chill that used to creep into your bones now has nowhere to travel. If you have a favorite chair, make it a personal radiator. Place a curved screen or a throw behind your back, and the heater's warmth returns to your chest instead of saluting the wall. Thermal mass belongs near the heater like a good teammate. Bookcases, water jugs, brick stacks, or a stone slab collect peaks and release them as the evening lengthens, and your room stops feeling like a bell that only knows loud or quiet. Water is the quiet all-star because it holds heat without drama. Fill sealed containers and line them safely near the heat source. Then watch how the room keeps its promise past bedtime with no extra flame. Humidity needs a steady hand because dry air steals comfort from lungs and skin. Keep a small pot on a low simmer or use a safe humidifier, and the cough that haunted winter steps back without turning the room into a swamp. Windows are doors for light and sometimes for grief. Use layered curtains that open to winter sun and close to night, and a simple side seal with a rolled towel or a taped felt strip will teach a draft to mind its manners. South light is a free heater when the sun rides low. Keep glass clear by day and covered by night, and you have built the Adobe trick without mud or Adobe law on the bookshelf. If you live in an apartment, you still own the air near you. A door sock, a curtain 2 inches from the wall, and a respectful seat placement will beat a space heater set to heroics every single time. A compact recap keeps the hands moving. Shake the envelope, trap the cold at the door, lift the body off the cold floor, add mass near the heat, and tune moisture so breath feels like yours again. The old ember habit returns today as thermostat literacy. Let your heater rest low at night while mass carries the room, then lift it gently at dawn, and you will have heat where you need it without whiplash on the meter. Hot stones still have a job if you treat them with caution. Warm a ceramic brick or a sealed hot water bottle on a stable surface. Wrap it and place it at the foot of the bed, and you have bought yourself calm joints without asking the heater to argue with midnight. Lamp heat deserves respect because flame and enclosed spaces are not casual friends. The modern translation is a small radiant panel used as a local sun, paired with humidity and a back reflector, which gives you the lamp effect without smoke or risk. Kitchen tasks can double as climate helpers if you mind ventilation. A low simmer now and then maintains humidity and warms hands, and a well-placed vent carries cooking fumes away without punishing the air you fought to steady. Cold storage lives best in the room's cool band. Place root baskets or sealed goods near the entrance pocket. Keep bedding in the warm zone, and you will stop paying for your food to heat your pillow or for your pillow to cool your dinner. If you have a hallway, make it your village lane. A short inner curtain turns it into a mild zone that feeds the main room gently, and your front bench stops feeling like a test. Radiant comfort beats convective bravado for tired bodies. A warmer surface near you feels kinder than a hotter air far from you, and the backrest trick proves it in a minute with no lecture. A careful recap helps newcomers hold the map. Most of the work is in arranging air and surfaces so the heater can whisper, not in making the heater shout and then apologizing to your skin. Apartments with shared corridors can borrow the neighborhood idea. A building vestibule, a door curtain, and a culture of closing both doors quietly will pay out in quieter halls and lower bills that have no patience for drama. If you can choose a room in winter, pick the one that faces sun and hides from wind. The choice is older than catalogues and younger than your next cup of tea, and it saves you more work than any slogan. Disagreement exists among builders about how tight a home should be. One side says seal everything and use mechanical ventilation for control, while the other warns against suffocating the room and advocates small, disciplined leaks with careful heat recovery, and both agree that uncontrolled drafts are the enemy, not fresh air. A simple deflector makes fans smarter and flames steadier. Place a small shield so incoming air does not slap a heater or a stove, and flow will strengthen without sending heat into a tantrum. Masonry heaters are the modern cousin of the earth lodge if your codes and budget allow. A short hot burn warms a dense core that glows gently all day, and your evenings stop being a cycle of feeding and cooling that feels like tending an impatient pet. Where masonry is out of reach, build a small island of mass with brick or stone around the heater. The island calms peaks and shares warmth with bodies that like predictability more than spectacle. If your home relies on a heat pump, the 7 habits still lead the band. Line the walls inside, create a vestibule, add mass, tune humidity, and let the pump cruise at a steady setting, and you will feel less like you are negotiating with a machine and more like you are living with a partner. Stairs and lofts make warm bands visible. Sleep a little higher if you can, store goods a little lower, and give the entry the cool work, and the same square footage becomes smarter without building new space. Clothes and rooms cooperate or argue. Wear layers that trap air and shed sparks while the room returns radiant heat to your chest, and the two will meet in the middle like polite collies who read the same memo. If you keep a wood stove, give it manners. Use a thermometer to stay in the clean burn band, add a kettle to tame dryness. Sweep the chimney on schedule and let bricks and water carry the rest rather than trying to impress the rafters. Stone boiling has a quiet modern twin in steam care for winter air. Warm water used for cleaning hands and tools keeps skin intact and lungs calm, which is comfort measured in fewer cracks and fewer sighs disguised as coughs. A practical recap keeps the lamp lit. Heat what matters, where it matters, for as long as it matters, and ask the room to share the work so the flame can stay small enough to mind itself. Neighborhoods can adopt the shared hearth principle without smoke. A library, church hall, or community center that holds steady air with vestibules, mass, and humidified heat will become the warm bench for a block and reduce the number of losing fights between families and their meters. Snow is free insulation if you let it behave. Bank drifts against windward walls and fences, clear sun paths on the leeward side, and the landscape will do half your weatherproofing while children think the shovel game is about fortresses. If the power goes out, mass and stones keep dignity intact. A brick jacket or heated water kept ahead of time will carry you through the first cold edge, and a wrapped hot water bottle returns feeling to toes with a kindness that never shows up on a bill. Respect flows both ways in this borrowing. These methods come from Native American rooms tuned by long winters, and carrying them forward with credit and care honors the people who designed comfort as a community craft rather than as a shopping trip. Some will ask whether modern insulation makes all of this redundant. The answer is that insulation is the shell, while the 7 habits are the choreography inside, and a silent ensemble still turns a good stage into a good night. Wind outside the door will always have an opinion. A vestibule and a low flame with mass shrug at that opinion without getting personal, which is a useful emotional skill wrapped in physics. If you have one afternoon and no budget, do 3 things and notice the change. Hang an inner curtain on your coldest wall, build a door pocket with a second covering, and place a backrest reflector behind your favorite seat, then watch the heater relax the way shoulders do when a good song finally finds the room. If you have one weekend, add mass and humidity. Set brick or water near the heater, tune a steady pot, and aim your chairs at warmth rather than at the appliance, and you will wonder why you ever chase the flame like a sports score. If you're building from scratch, ask the old questions before you pour anything. Where does the wind come from in the hard month? Where does the low sun land in the kind month? And how can the entry learn to collect itself before it asks the room to try again? The closing recap pays the debt to memory and to comfort. Convection liners, thermal mass, cold traps, gentle radiant sources, hot stone batteries, banked embers, and movable insulation turn houses into quiet machines that stretch every unit of fuel and every hour of patience. These habits won against wind on plains, in river towns, in cedar lanes, in adobe plazas, in pit houses and under snow lamps. They still win in apartments, rentals, farmhouses, and code-compliant buildings when you let them, because bodies have not changed and winter has not changed either. You can feel the result without measuring it if you sit still for a minute. The kettle breathes instead of shouting, the draft does not lick your ankles, and the heater stops performing and starts keeping a promise that does not need a speech. A last small test lands the lesson in your hands. Move your chair, hang a curtain, add a brick, and notice that comfort comes from design rather than noise, which is exactly what winter asked of every good room that ever learned to be kind. The story ends where the evening begins. A little flame, a listening room, and people who know what to adjust make a winter that leaves energy for work, for company, and for sleep, which is the best joke comfort ever told because it is shaped entirely by results.